Hello, so in this screencast we are going to continue talking about evolution, and we'll briefly touch on something called macroevolution, but then focus more on microevolution. So first up, what is macroevolution? So usually these are going to be pieces of evolution that are supporting the concept of evolution. And so you can think of macroevolution as evolution on a grand scale. So what we see when we're looking at the overarching history of life. So the changing, the lineages that come up, extinction, stability. Okay, so macroevolution is evolution on a scale of separated gene pools. And so when you're doing studies on macroevolution, you're looking at change that occurs at or above the level of a species, which is in contrast to microevolution, which is referring to smaller evolutionary changes. And we typically describe those as changes in allele frequencies within a particular species or population. So hopefully from class today you are convinced that evolution does exist. We're going to shift our focus to talk about some mechanisms that drive evolution. And there are two ways to think about evolution. One, you can think about it as a way to explain the lineage or the descent of common ancestry. And then the other way is to help us explain the diversity of life that we see today. But let's talk about a third thing, which is the concept of evolution as the change in allele frequency in a population over time. Make sure that you write this down. Make sure you pause and do that. But let's go into a bit more detail here. So if we have a specific allele, and we're looking at the frequency of it going from being non-existent, right, so there are 0 of them in the population, to then having one of those alleles in a population of species. If it's a good thing, then maybe having many of those alleles, maybe we'll have many of those alleles in the population. And it doesn't matter if it's going to be a dominant or a recessive allele. If it's good, you'll tend to get more of them. But if it's beneficial, then it'll start to show up more. And instead of just having one, we're going to have many of those alleles present. And if you'll recall, an allele is going to be a molecular form of a gene. And we know from the central dogma of biology, right, DNA make proteins. Those proteins are then used to create specific traits and behaviors. So we know that genes within DNA are going to be coding for proteins, and ultimately it's those proteins that are responsible for our traits and behaviors. But make sure you're thinking of these behaviors as more like activities and functions, like for instance being able to roll your tongue. It's not specifically a personality trait per se, so behavior sometimes isn't the best word to use there. So understand that if we have a new allele and it leads to the production of a different protein, then a different trait or behavior could be beneficial, and it will turn into a situation that everyone will want, and then it's ideal to mate with someone that has that trait. And slowly but surely you'll have many of those alleles start popping up in the population after several generations. And the accumulation of these beneficial alleles, it will ultimately lead to something called speciation, which is the formation of new and distinct species in the course of evolution. Now, before we move on, I want to briefly touch on something called gene pools. And here we're talking about pooling of actual materials, right? Not something you're going to go jump into when you're hot. And let's say that, the entire class, we're all outside on a nature walk, and it starts to get really hot, and we're climbing this mountain, but you guys brought backpacks, and some of you have some candy or other pieces of food. And if we were to pool all of the food together to make sure that everyone has a little bit of something and doesn't starve, that is called pooling the resources, okay? And it's kind of a theoretical pool in the case that we're talking about here. So the gene pool is going to be a collection of genes associated with a population to which organisms in that population will have access. So a population has a gene pool, but an individual will only have a subset of that. And that subset is coming from their mom and dad. So each of us has a very limited gene pool, but the human species population as a whole has a lot of genes that exist out there, and they have a much bigger gene pool, right? So if an organism had the ability to mate with whoever it wanted, then in some sense you would have access to a much larger and a significant chunk of that gene pool. Let's move on now to talk about some microevolutionary forces that exist that lead to evolution. So here we were touching on gene pools. It's important to keep that in mind as we talk about these different forces here. So there are 4 of them. Let's list them out for you. Mutations are important. Then we'll go on to talk about gene flow. And these are going to be the 2 that we focus on in this screencast. But there are 2 others. We will talk about natural selection and something called genetic drift. Again, we're focusing here on 1 and 2 in this screencast. So all 4 of these are things that ultimately lead to evolution, like I described earlier, right? Remember the definition there is evolution as a change in allele frequency in a population over time. And the 4 things that we mentioned, those 4 microevolutionary forces, they all lead to this type of evolution. So let's talk about mutations. And this is the most important of the forces that exist that would drive evolution. And this is because mutations are going to be the source of all new alleles in our universe. So let's say that here in this image, right where it's lit up a little bit on that chromosome, the chromosomes are replicated, but it suddenly has developed a mutation. So alleles used to exist in one molecular state, and then all of a sudden we're getting this change here where it's lit up in the A's, C's, T's, and G's. So now here there's going to be a new molecular form of the gene, and it could potentially lead to the production of a new protein. If you remember back to our study of genetics and mutations, most mutations are going to be neutral or harmful, but every now and then you'll get a beneficial mutation. So successful mutations are the ones that are going to stick around in the population. So here's another image, and we have our normal DNA strand here on the left, but then we see shown in red in these 2 locations that we don't really know why, but for some reason there are 2 mutations. This then could lead to the formation of different amino acids, which will then create a different protein, and it might be something that's harmful, neutral, or it could be beneficial. So keep in mind that a mutation is what's ultimately taking us from the concept of having none of these alleles to suddenly having a single copy of the allele, okay? So the single event, this one mutation, is an evolutionary event. We're having a change in the allele frequency in a population, going from a frequency of 0 to 1 in that population. Let's move on now to talk about the second thing, which is the concept of gene flow. So to talk about this, let's imagine that we have 2 different populations. We have a population over here, and we have a population over here. But that population is separated by a big ocean. So this is just some geographical barrier. It could be a mountain, it could be an ocean, it could be a stream, but it's preventing the 2 populations from intermingling, even though here and here we have the same species. The 2 populations are made of the same species, but they're different populations because they are separated. So write it down there that they are the same species, both species A. We can think of them as, a particular species of bird. But they're going to be different populations. The green is population 1, and the blue will be population 2. And let's say that in population 1 there's a mutation, and we create a new allele. Let's just call it allele Y. And that allele doesn't exist over here in population 2. But allele Y is really a really great allele, and so it starts to become very prevalent here in population 1. There we go, getting lots of them. Keep in mind that it will become prevalent in this population over many millennia, so hundreds of thousands of years. It's not all of a sudden. And all of these species A in population 1 will have this, we'll say they eventually all now have this special Y allele. So let's look at the movement or flow of alleles from this one population to the other one over here. Let's imagine there is a bad hurricane, and normally species A and B can't get through the major ocean here, but the hurricane picked up a bird from species A, population 1, and then it deposited it in species 2. So here it comes, and now it's moving over to population 2. And population 2 didn't have that Y allele before, but now it suddenly does. So over here, it went from having 0 to 1 alleles. And it didn't happen because of mutations in this population, but it happened because of gene flow. And then over millions of years, if it's beneficial, then Y could be prevalent in population 2, and we may start to see more of that. But this also could happen in the opposite direction. You could have instead the mutation happening in population 2, and then with gene flow having it move to population 1. It could go in either direction, right? So I'll erase those there. So these are the two things that I wanted to talk about. Gene flow, which is a way of moving these old alleles to a different new population. And then we talked about mutations, which is just the formation of an entirely new allele, and it's going into the entire species that exists on Earth.